So I'm going to start with a story. And this is actually the story of Mansi, who's a 17-year-old girl who I came across at one of our workshops on equipping young women to actually use the internet and digital technologies freely and fearlessly, right? So Mansi lives in Dharavi. This was about 4 years ago, and I still remember this. And she was super bright, super chirpy in the workshop, really good with the mobile phone, etc. And then, we asked her something and she said, I'm not using mobile phones any longer. And I was like, why? Because it was obvious she was like totally born to this, right? And she said, no, I was getting very addicted and I failed an exam. And so I've stopped using it and stuff. And I felt like there may be a little more to this than meets the eye. So later, privately, I sort of was chatting with her, and then the real story came out. And that's what I want to share with you, which is that Mansi A didn't have her own phone then. Her two brothers, who were 21 and 24 years respectively, did. And they came from a low-income family, which is why they live in Dharavi, which is a slum community in Mumbai, where I live as well. So she didn't have her own phone. They did. Despite this, she used the family phone, etc. And she had her own Facebook account. And basically, some guy struck up a friendship with her, and then somehow started coming to the area where they lived, and she didn't really know how. But what was really interesting was when she was telling me the story, she said, I was a little creeped out by him prowling around my house, but I was more worried that what would happen if my family found out. And sure enough, this is exactly what happened. Her family did find out, and her brothers essentially then put heavy pressure on her and took her off Facebook, right? So basically her access to the internet or to digital technologies got blocked right then and there for no reason, for no fault of hers whatsoever, but the repercussion of the impact came on her. And I want to start here because I think this is really the problem that we face at the root when it comes to mobile technologies or when it comes to online. Different genders are treated differently, and there's discrimination across genders, with girls, women, trans people, etc., facing the brunt of the discrimination, as we saw in the case of Mansi. And so even if there is a mobile phone in the family, the kind of use that a woman has, etc., is restricted, curtailed, surveilled, etc. It's super interesting to me that Mansi was more scared of her family, right? And she knew they wouldn't support her, but they would sort of restrict her, etc., in this kind of context. And that is pretty much what happens. So this is no different from what actually happens in offline spaces. In offline spaces as well, we see that there is this very protectionist kind of attitude taken to women, where in the name of keeping them safe or for their own good, and I hope you can see my quote marks, all sorts of restrictions, censoring, caging, physical mobility being blocked, all of this stuff is placed on women, just like Mansi's digital mobility was curtailed here. I've actually been told that we can show you all stuff, so I want to show you all something right now. So I'm just going to share my screen. So if you can see my screen, then what you see is a little table which says girls unfreedom and boys freedom. And this is pretty much what I mean by discrimination and mobile or digital technologies. This is something that we actually gathered in workshops from young people in the sort of 15 to 19-year-old age group, all in low-income communities in rural and urban India. And every single girl, I don't know if you can read it clearly, so I'll just tell you a little bit, but it's pretty much that, if you're a girl, you get a mobile phone much a cheaper mobile, your phones are checked daily. You're not necessarily allowed to use every app. You have to keep justifying why you need a phone. If you talk too much on the phone, you're told like you're not behaving like a good girl, etc. Speaking too much, right? Too much expression, too much voice. You're told you're loose. You're not allowed to talk on the phone at night. Often, like, you're not even allowed to charge your own phone. Whereas on the right-hand side, we have the other column, which is all the freedoms that are given to boys in the same sphere. And I wanted to actually show you all something which I liked very much, which is a little poster that was created by a bunch of students at the Srishti School of Design in Bangalore, which looked at the concept of the good girl and the bad girl. And they have a whole bunch of things, right? Like a bad girl is someone who smokes and drinks, eats too much, pouts, can't make round rotis, has breasts, etc., walks outside with her hair open, eats too less. And I think if you add to this, what you'll see is there's one which relates to the internet here, which is watches pornography. But pretty much everything I showed you from the other little chart that I showed you, we could go one step further and we could say, hey, a bad girl is somebody who talks too much on the phone, who uses all these apps, who talks to boys, etc. So you see how the way in which we have come to mobility, and by mobility I now mean digital mobility, is we've pretty much carried all the concepts from the offline world online, which is we've carried the same set of gender norms. And gender norms, very simply put, is a set of rules for different genders, right? And in a patriarchal system, of course, needless to say, these rules do not benefit women, do not benefit marginalized genders. They usually benefit men and boys. But, this is what sits below these norms or these rules. It's like an iceberg. So at the tip of the iceberg is our little mobile phone and us like doing whatever. And below that, as you go deeper, are all these norms and rules that actually govern who gets to use these digital technologies and on what terms, right? And we see very clearly from a million stories across India that girls, women, trans persons, queer individuals, etc., still do not have the freedom and the power to use digital technologies on their own terms, but rather on the terms set by others, parents, families, communities, societies, all of it going back to sort of the rules that society has set for different genders. Okay, let me stop the share for a minute and go back to this. Okay, so how does this affect us during the pandemic or during the situation we find ourselves in, lockdown? I would argue that this has now gone from being a problem to a serious, very urgent problem, simply because digital technologies and particularly mobile phones have in the last 6 months emerged as life-saving equipment. It's fairly obvious to all of us that, in the early days, whether you wanted relief because you didn't have food in your house, you wanted food security, you needed health services, you needed education, right? You needed some sort of digital device to be able to do any or all of these. Not to mention just to do like the daily things that make life worth living, right? Like chatting with your friends, maybe like watching a movie, scrolling through social media, all that kind of stuff. But what has happened now, and I'm just going to give you a few examples of this, is in contexts where access is conditional, contingent, curtailed for a bunch of genders. What that means is that their access to all these things also, health, rights, food, education, just, leisure, play, like just living, all of that is actually restricted as well. And here are some examples. Let's start with something that's been talked about a lot in the last few months, which is the example of domestic violence. what happens when you are a woman who lives in a community in a small house where you don't have physical privacy, first of all, and you experience domestic violence before and during the pandemic. The difference is before the pandemic, you could go out of that house, you could find somebody who you could report this violence to if that's the pathway that you chose. You had some remedy available to you. The difference is in the last 6 months, if you don't have access to that mobile phone, or if the way you use that phone is constantly being watched, how on earth are you going to be able to report this kind of violence that you face freely? You're not going to be able to. And if it's a shared phone, the situation becomes even worse, because then you might actually have to borrow a phone from the person who is inflicting violence on you. I mean, who does that, right? And then you would have to complain, and then you would be totally scared that you've left that phone number on that phone, because you can't erase that phone number, right? And then the person who's inflicting violence on you has access to that number and may call that number, and that may lead to further violence, right? So you see how complicated it is. Just that not having unconditional access to that simple mobile phone because of this, all these rules for genders lying below it. And I forgot to say actually that a lot of these gender rules are really about sexuality. So the reason parents or spouses or brothers, when we spoke to girls at workshops, they said bhai log are the worst, even worse than our parents, and they restrict us the most. And what are they trying to restrict? They are trying to restrict the freedom of women and girls to basically just go out, make their own friendships, hey, maybe get into romantic relationships, maybe flirt with people, in essence, what we call controlling our own sexuality. That is what is seen as a threat, and that is what is sought to be controlled, always in the name of keeping us safe. And it's really absolute bullshit. So a couple of other examples. We spoke to college principals in rural West Bengal. And in girls' colleges, we found that 80% of the girls actually don't have access to a phone. So how on earth are they going to continue their education? And what is the message that you're giving them when they see their brothers actually, having their own phone to continue their education freely? Similarly, we've also talked about play, leisure, just hanging out, right? Like so many of us have just somehow got through the last few months just by talking to friends, etc. And finally, I want to say that similarly, if you're trans, if you're queer, if you live in a family where you're not out, then the norms that you're looking at are actually even more complicated, because your sexuality or your gender identity is not approved of, right? So there's an additional sort of set of rules. And we know of cases where people have been inadvertently outed in the last few months, because you're at home, you keep your phone lying around, someone picks it up, someone sees a picture, someone reads something, etc. And then they have faced family stigma, violence, and, again, a whole bunch of other restrictions. So going forward, I just want to end by saying a couple of things, because I don't want to run out of time, which is that we need to think of this far more expansively. At the surface level, we can think of things like data fellowships, the way we used to think of school scholarships, right? We ourselves have had to, so if we want like girls to continue their education, etc., we have to think more expansively of the technologies that we use when we are talking about marginalized communities, because many of these people are not on Instagram or Twitter or whatever, and find these totally alienating spaces, right? These ecosystems. So we really have to think about, we are starting work with a group of domestic workers in Kolkata, and our trainings are all using basically small YouTube videos in Bangla and classes on WhatsApp groups. So we have to enter the ecosystem that marginalized communities use, right? we have to really start using those apps where they feel comfortable, where they feel a sense of belonging, because we know from the research that, the apps that are used, apart from WhatsApp and a couple of others, I mean, Facebook and Instagram and Twitter may remain aspirational apps, but there are also a whole bunch of apps that are used that people like perhaps are not using, right? So that's something we need to think about. But I'm going to just stop by saying that ultimately, this whole question of bringing tech to marginalized communities and to girls and women and trans persons within marginalized communities is not a question of technology. It is primarily a social question. And the way we have to solve it at its roots is by chipping away continuously at these gender rules and at these gender norms that make women and girls unequal in our societies. Thank you.